Thank you all for coming today. This is Nutrition Talks by OmegaQuant Analytics. It's a series of monthly webinars aimed at providing current research and education for our healthcare practitioner providers and partners. My name is Christina Jackson. I'm the Director of Research and the Chief Operating Officer at OmegaQuant. And our presentation today is on omega-3s and sports performance, and the presenter is Tavis Piattoly, Dietitian and Healthcare Account Educator for OmegaQuant. So Tavis has been working in the field of high performance and sports nutrition for the past 21 years, designing personalized nutrition and supplement programs for high school, college, professional, and Olympic athletes. He currently serves as the dietitian and healthcare account manager at OmegaQuant, and their team works to research and provide omega-3 testing and personalized nutrition for healthcare practitioners, collegiate and professional teams, and military testing labs, and also supplement brands. So he works across a wide variety of industries. He is also an adjunct professor at Concordia University of Chicago's Sport Nutrition and Exercise Science Department. He was the sports dietitian for the New Orleans Saints from 2006 to 2013, for the New Orleans Pelicans from 2008 to 2013, and Tulane Athletics from 2002 to 2014. He spent 15 years in the vitamin and supplement industry, helping companies launch vitamin and supplement brands, along with consulting for brands on product formulation and ingredient sourcing. And he served on the scientific advisory boards for Nordic Naturals and Examine.com. So we're very excited to hear Tavis talk about his expertise today. So a little bit of administration notes. So the presentation today will be an hour long with 10 to 15 minutes reserved for questions at the end. Type any questions you have in the comment or comments into the chat box, and we will address them at the end. The webinar is eligible for 1 CEU credit for our registered dietitians and DTRs, and we will email the certificates to those who attend the full webinar. So thank you all so much for attending today, and I will turn it over to Tavis.
Thanks, Christina. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Christina, just let me know if everything shows up. I have to move it to 1. Is that showing up okay?
That looks great.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Excited to be here and talk about just really the versatility of omega-3. Where does the role in performance, especially diving into the brain health side of things and in concussion, man. And we have a lot of slides, a lot of research slides. So I'm going to try to get to all of these in that hour, and then we'll open some times up for questions. So just a little bit of a quick overview is really what are omega-3 fatty acids, right? These are polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're essential. We need to consume them from the diet. And our really 2 key components that we're going to discuss today, especially on the science side, is the role of EPA and DHA, right? So mostly from a fatty, oily fish side, algae, krill, that's where you're going to get the primary sources of these. Same thing with DHA. The body does convert some DHA back to EPA to keep those levels balanced. And then there's ALA, right? Plant-based options that we do find in some leafy greens, flaxseed, chia, some soybean oils, but there's just a poor conversion, right? So one of the things we see, especially when we do our testing at OmegaQuant, is just the lowest levels are going to be those in vegans because they're not consuming algae-rich types foods. When we look at food sources, the best food sources are going to be from marine sources, fish and seafood, up to somewhere between about 1.8 to 2 grams of 2,000 milligrams combined of EPA and DHA in certain foods. And of course, supplementation will just depend on type, brand, size of capsule, liquid. I'm going to go through that towards the end of this presentation. But when you look at standard supplementation used throughout, there's a variety of products today that just don't really have a lot of omega-3, and it's not moving the needle when it comes to driving our blood amino acid, our blood omega-3 levels. So when we look at benefits of omega-3s for athletes, I mean, we can talk about a lot of these different things. There's so many different ways when someone says, I want to enhance performance. That's a big word, but the benefits really cover a lot of different spectrums. Cardiovascular, we'll talk about cognitive function. I'm not going to go into the cardiovascular. We had a presentation in October that was done on that, but we'll talk a little bit about body fat and lean tissue, lean muscle preservation, muscle growth recovery. Going to dive into the inflammatory side of things and some newer studies that were done in collegiate athletes, really go into some depth on some studies that were done on concussion, as well as one that was published in 2022. And then mood support is one of those others, but we're not going to dive into that today. We can't forget to talk about omega-6, though. We talk a lot about omega-3, but we also have to talk about omega-6 because they are equally important. They get a bad reputation, but these are also polyunsaturated fatty acids. We do have to consume them from the diet. And some of the benefits are pretty equivalent to omega-3, but When we look at the amount of omega-6s consumed in the food supply, the food supply is really a lot of foods we consume today and processed foods and oils that are going to be very, very rich in omega-6. So you can see, as I'm going to dive into this, I'll talk about just a lot of those sources are going to be coming from different things, from soybean oil, walnut oil, corn oil. A lot of our processed foods are going to be very, very rich in omega-6. A lot of this started really back in the 60s, the late 60s, early 70s. There was a massive shift in using oils in the food supply because of just cost. It was a lot less expensive to use soybean oil to produce a lot of different products because it was cheaper, more profitability for large food companies. So we saw that significant increase in soybean oil production and use throughout. So when you look at that, it's like, where do we get most of this from? It's going to be vegetable and seed oils. Shortening margarine is still widely used in our diet today. And then, of course, some of the animals that are fed with more probably omega-6 rich foods and some things we consume through nuts and eggs, but that's a very small percentage. If we look historically at just, highly unsaturated fatty acids, especially omega-6, and things like mortality, morbidity, those countries, especially the US, we have a lot more mortality in tissue high unsaturated fatty acid from omega-6. It's just our diet is so saturated, and it's why we see a lot more inflammation compared to other countries, Japan, Greenland, countries that have a lot of omega-3 intake. This is just a study that was done or looking at the correlation between omega-6 and linoleic acid in chimpanzees. I know in adults, looking at chimpanzees as the baseline, but as we saw higher intakes of omega-6 fat throughout 1961 2008, we saw a higher increase in tissue body fat. So it was a little bit of a correlation there when looking at that intake. Our diet, our Western diet, is just an abundant of omega-6, right? So fried foods, and I'm based out right outside the New Orleans area, so we're known for fried seafood. It's not uncommon year-round to be consuming foods that are deep fried. It's delicious, it tastes good, but a lot of our food supply and a lot of our products on the market for the consumer that just don't know what to look for are hidden with a lot of omega-6 fats. And again, those biggest culprits are going to be vegetable oils as well as seed oils. If you look at this product in general, now, I'm not picking on any particular products, but this is great marketing, right? If you look at the product, it says, omega-3, EPA, DHA, and ALA, heart healthy, smart balance. But when we look at the oil blend and you look at the ingredient profile, you see the first ingredients, canola, then palm. They do actually use fish oil and butter. If this was 100% fish oil, this would probably not be a really good appetizing butter. Then flax and olive, then soybean oil. So a 6 different oil blend to make this product. When you look at certain types of mayos in the market, you look at that first mayo, the first ingredient, soybean oil. You look at this olive oil mayo. There's water, there's olive oil, there's canola oil, there's vinegar, and then there's soybean oil. So they have to do that. I mean, if this was a pure olive oil or avocado oil based mayo, the cost would be somewhere between probably $10 and $12 for that, just because of the cost of those oils are much more expensive. So how do we reverse that problem? Is we try to get a little bit of a better ratio. I mean, ideally 1-to-1, 2-to-1, somewhere between 3-to-1 would be really good. We rarely see that when testing. If we have a high omega-3 index, then we typically see obviously lower 6-to-3. But when we have a better ratio of 3-to-6 or even a low 6-to-3, healthier blood vessels, improvement in cardiovascular measures, reduced risk for plaque buildup, several forms of cancer we've seen in the science, and of course a reduction in triglycerides for those that have high levels. Testing omega-3, as we are a testing company, so that's what we do. And we look at your red blood cell, which looks at your omega-3 status over 4 months. But here's the key part, is looking at the correlation of what happens, especially on the cardiovascular side, when your levels are low versus when your levels are high. We know it's a global deficiency. The deficiency is quite wide, with close to about 90 to 95% of the entire population is deficient in omega-3, but it's not something we think about. A lot of people still today don't even realize we can actually test for omega-3 status. Just came back from a conference and people were still, practitioners were like, I did not realize we can measure omega-3. So it's still kind of an unknown secret hidden gem that needs to be discussed a lot more. Just real quick on the cardiovascular side, and our founder, Dr. Bill Harris, was part of this paper that he published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, just looking at your levels of omega-3 status versus your odds ratio for coronary heart disease, and saw when you're less than 4%, that odds ratio is quite high at 1. And when you get to that level of 8%, really 7.3% and greater, that odds ratio drops significantly to 0.2. And that's really no different between sudden cardiac death as well as primary cardiac arrest. So that correlation is still extremely important. So relative risk odds ratio is really based on your omega-3 status when looking at these markers. But this is not really much different when we look at collegiate and professional sports as well. This was a study by Anthony Anzalone and a lot of different colleagues, Aaron Carbon and a few other dietitians, Craig Moore, and a few other individuals that have published other papers when looking at omega-3 status and concussion, saw that 34% of these athletes had an omega index that would have considered them at being high risk. 66% had a risk that was considered to be either intermediate, but no one had a risk that was considered low risk. So no one tested positive or no one tested at 8% or higher. Then that was moved. John Davis from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute looked at the evaluation of omega-3 in professional basketball players. So those are NBA, G League players. The mean was about 5%. 31% consume no fish in the diet, and 61% consume less than 2 servings per week. Only 12% supplemented with omega-3, and the majority of players had levels below 8%. So this just shows, and this has been repeated in several other studies to show, our athletes are primarily going to be deficient in omega-3. So what's the role for athletes? Where do they come in? Let's first dive into the brain health side of things. And before we really get to the actual studies, what's a quick overview? We know about 60% of our brain's made up of fat. 25% of that comes from DHA, and that's the essential fatty acid we're going to be talking about today. So, this is the brick and mortar. Our brain, the brick and mortar is fatty acids. So in order to help that brain recover when there's damage, disruption, axonal brain injury, we need to understand how to feed the brain what it's made of in order to help it recover. So a brain injury, the pathophysiology of brain injury, happens when there's some sort of metabolic error in impaired blood flow. So when there's collisions, when there's constant repeated bouts of head trauma, it depletes the ATP, of our reserves in our brain, causes disruption of those pumps, high calcium influx to those damaged areas, and eventually that leads to neuronal cell death or a TBI or significant concussion. So that's really just kind of the etiology of where this happens. In a lot of our sports, we're going to see different types of impact. Now, where does the neuroprotective effect of DHA come in is really releasing DHA from the cell membrane. It helps with resolvins and lipoxins. And then the neuroprotectin D1 enzyme really helps when it comes to providing neuroprotection in anti-apoptotic protection, as well as in anti-inflammatory or increasing neuroinflammation or improving neuroinflammation. So as you can see, the versatility of omega-3 kind of promotes that, helps the cell survive a little bit better. It reduces the cell damage or cell death in the brain, also reduces oxidative stress, improves synaptic plasticity, and also improves neurotransmission. Before we kind of go into the concussion side of things, just some other areas that really focus on brain function. We look at a study that was done in children and adults with autism who received multiple nutrient supplements with EPA and DHA starting around day 60. And the treatment dose was depending on the size of the individual. So from 30 to 50 pounds to 100 pounds plus, you can see received anywhere from 1 gram of EPA and DHA, a little bit more on the EPA side, up to 2.1 to 1.4 grams of EPA and DHA combined, depending on what they weighed. And pretty much all markers of autism improve throughout. So all of those markers on the spectrum improve from performance, symptoms, functionality, behavior, and social response got better in the treatment group versus the non-treatment group. We look at ADD and ADHD. This was a systematic review of 16 randomized controlled trials that looked at a little over 1,500 children or people up to the age of 18 with ADHD. And then they had to be taking omega-3 supplement with EPA, DHA, and GLA. And the 4 studies used a ratio of 9 to 3 to 1. 13 of the 16 studies looked at demonstrated favorable benefits on ADHD symptoms, and those that were consuming omega-3 were able to lower their dose of traditional medicine and proved it to be an effective adjunct therapy. So it's not a treatment, it's not a cure, it's just a way to help provide additional therapy. And I can speak from my daughter who's 11 is on ADD medicine, and she's been using liquid fish oil since she was 3 months old. But at the same time, sometimes things, it's only going to help improve those outcomes. It's not going to completely prevent it. When we look at just the progression of concussion in sport, right? We look at some of the older data. from 2012. There was about 3.8 million concussions, and 47% of that was from football. Then hockey and soccer kind of follow through, and 33% of those were happening at practice. A lot of invisible wounds, some things not reported, things not really, understandable. You don't have the medical staff on the sideline in some of these places where things can get treated. But if we look at kind of the progression over the course of time, and again, this is a little bit older data, I'll get into the newer data. High school is a place where there's the greatest number of athletes, and you can see we put a lot of the focus on professional sports, but really youth sports is where a lot of this is happening on a regular basis. This was a newer study that was done in 2019 that looked at the incidence and risk of concussion in youth athletes and looked at different ages, genders, different types of sports, positions, and especially on football. And you can see here the risk was really greatest in wrestling and martial arts. And again, I'm not sure how they controlled for this and if they did, but looking at different position groups as well. Wrestling, martial arts were the highest, with cheerleading and football kind of falling right around the same when it comes to the risk percentage and number of concussions. Obviously, there were more athletes in football than any other sport, so they had the greatest number of concussions. If we looked at different position sports, if we break down football by sport, running backs had the highest percent risk, defensive backs, and then followed by kicker, which was kind of surprising, but again, a smaller number of individuals. NFL data was pretty interesting, but what I circled was really COVID years, so shouldn't really change much of the data, but it is interesting to see kind of where we've come with the NFL's data from 2015 all the way to now, which drastic decrease in the number of concussions. I'll be curious to see how things have changed in 2022. But obviously, we're a lot more aware. We have a lot more medical guidance in analyzing. We have also representatives that are not on the team looking for signs and symptoms for athletes to pull them from a game and get them analyzed as well as evaluated to make sure when they do or if they can return to play, it's done under supervision. So other studies have been done in the Journal of Pediatrics as well. It's just looked at, proportions of sport-related concussions from 2013 to 2018, and obviously, those sports that stand out the most are going to be your hockeys, your football, lacrosse, girls field hockey, things where a lot of head trauma are going to happen on a repetitive basis. So right now, the current treatment for protocol, there's impact programs. There's some really great companies that are doing a phenomenal job now of testing and trying to make sure athletes get proper care, but also proper evaluation, right? Athletes want to go back in. They wake up, they get dizzy, they think it's okay, they can shake it off, but they really have to get proper care because this can be life-threatening. So the treatment now is obviously removed from play immediately, physical and cognitive rest. There's some exercise with some of the new studies that have been done, not always putting someone under dark light. Sometimes there's medications, but there's really nothing that has truly addressed the nutritional support of the brain itself. And probably the last 5 to 10 years, things started getting a little bit more attractive with some of the research when it comes to what are some nutrients that we can provide the brain to help it heal. Just like when we have inflammation in the body, there's other ways that we can actually help the body and brain heal. So a lot of this started years ago. Dr. Julian Bales was one of the first that kind of started playing around and experimenting with certain therapies when we had accidents. So this was a teenager with a severe traumatic brain injury. And again, this was just a really rare case. So they had a Glasgow Coma score of 3, so they were in a deep unconsciousness, right subdural and small temporal hematoma. By day 10, they believed he was in a vegetative state, placed a tracheotomy and peg tube, started enteral feedings, and was not given the weekend to live. Well, they were like, let's try something that really has never been tried before. Let's put a lot of omega-3. And again, we're not advising you to do this by any means, but they put up to 17 grams inside their peg tube, and 10 days later, they were able to wean off the ventilator and begin rehabilitation. Now, keep in mind, this is an N of 1. This doesn't work every single time, but it was something that kind of just sparked the conversation to get these things kind of evaluated a little bit more. And then Dr. Julian Bales, again, was involved in the paper when they had a mining accident in West Virginia in 2006. There was one lone survivor out of 14. That individual obviously was suffering from respiratory distress due to elevated CO levels, lung collapse, unresponsive, comatose by the time they were able to get him out of the mine. Did the same type of protocol through peg tube, had a full recovery. Again, another N of 1. But again, it's just something to where experimentation leads to more design and more studies, and eventually led to what we have now today. So he also continued to explore this a lot more and started using, obviously, rodent models to induce concussion management and really started seeing improved outcomes. So Then additional studies started looking at, let's look at other markers of axonal brain injury. So neurofilament light, also known as NFL, is one of those key fibers in neurons and the axonal skeleton, but really unsure of the mechanism of release and the appearance of NFL, in those biological fluids. Nutritional support with high doses of EPA does not work for every injured patient. That's the one thing that we know, is that it's not always going to work. Although it's been shown to be very promising, it is not a guaranteed source. So, with neurofilament light as well as cerebral spinal fluid, we know those that are suffering from any type of TBI, those are going to be elevated, and then we want to try to see what we can do from a nutritional standpoint to help lower those. So, the first really study in athletes over especially a long period of time was John Oliver's work, kind of looking at the course of the entire football season and said, let's just give these individuals a lot of DHA and let's see what happens. So when we look at the study design, the goal was to look at the effects of DHA on neurofilament light. So this was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled 81 college athletes that were going to ingest 2, 4, 6, or 6 grams of DHA, a big dose, or giving them corn oil. 189 days was the length of this study, so looked at the course of the entire season from summer conditioning all the way to 109 days of football. It was really interesting to see some of the outcomes. So just looking at starters versus non-starters, we know starters are going to have a lot more increase in neurofilament light. So this looks at the changes in neurofilament light or brain damage or brain injury over the course of that time. Starters are going to have a lot more repeated bouts of head trauma, especially those running backs, those interior linemen that are always, combating heads on a regular basis. So we expect to see more inflammation in the brain versus those that might be squad members or just practice squad, don't get a lot of repetition, don't get in the game, so they're going to have less trauma to the brain. But the treatment group, so when we look at the effects of DHA on neurofilament light, you can see that black bar at the bottom showed a significant reduction, pretty close early on, but as the season progressed, you can see those that were not in the treatment group, neurofilament light significantly elevated by the start of the season, but those that were on an omega-3 product had a significant reduction in neurofilament light. So that's quite impressive to see even by the end of the season. It looked like there was a good protective mechanism being provided by using omega-3. Now, what was very interesting was the dose, because I would have thought that 6-gram dose would have had the best outcome, but that was not the case in this study. The 2-gram dose had the most impressive outcome. So what led us to think maybe we don't need as much as we thought we did. And you can see from treatment, from T8 all the way from placebo to 2 grams, that's a massive change from baseline when you look at treatment group versus placebo group, and the fact that DHE was very effective in all cases, even with 4 grams, but still the 2-gram group provided the best outcome. So this was the first study to really look at that outcome. And then this was followed up by Jeffrey Heilson and team with a lot of other individuals. John Oliver was part of this, a few others that looked at other different markers, but also wanted to add EPA to this and also look at omega-3 index. So they assessed omega-3 supplement of EPA and DHA to see would it attenuate serum neurofilament light, but also improve aspects of cardiovascular disease in college athletes. This was a multi-site looking at 2 football teams. So there were 31 in the treatment group, 2,900 milligrams, so a 2,000 or 2-gram dose of DHA and a 560 milligram dose of EPA. The control group received no supplementation. They looked at markers of inflammation as well, omega-3 index and neurofilament light. So as expected, those that were receiving omega-3 supplementation saw an improvement in their omega-3 index, and those that don't or didn't saw a decrease for the majority of that group. All subjects, when we look at all subjects that were on omega-3 versus control, you can see the effects of omega-3 on serum neurofilament light over the course of the study showed a reduction in neurofilament light, and that didn't matter if they were starters or non-starters. That just showed a significant reduction from baseline. Now, those that were in the starters, compared to these were just starters, those that saw a lot of playing time and saw obviously a lot more head trauma over the course of the study, but you can see a very similar outcome than the previous study. So those 2,000 or 2,800 milligrams that included a little bit of EPA saw an improvement in outcomes, and even towards the end, doing week 6, saw really good outcomes as well compared to those that still we're seeing increases in neurofilament light. So overall, a similar replication from the first study that was done. Now, here was the most recent study that was published in May of this year in the Journal of Nutrients, looking at the effects of fish oil and biomarkers of axonal injury, but also looking at markers of inflammation. So a little bit of a different design, but somewhat similar. So they wanted to look at omega-3 supplement on inflammatory cytokines as well, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor. A smaller group, that 19 athletes on the treatment side. They actually looked at about 100 and something athletes, but I think 70 of those athletes declined to continue to participate. The difference in this was they looked at ethyl ester form of fish oil. I'll explain that a little bit later and what that means. 3,500 milligrams, about a 2,400 milligram dose of DHA, similar to other studies, but they used a different form. So could that have an impact and outcome? The control group used safflower oil, and then they looked at blood samples throughout. So this is a little bit about what that study looked like from baseline. You can kind of see we're not going to walk through all this just due to time. You'll have a replay of this to watch later if you'd like to watch the replay. So what was the effects of omega-3 on EPA and DHA? As expected, those in the treatment group, and it's a little awkward to look at this compared to like a graph over the course of time. So these are a little bit more confusing when I look at these versus if I get to see like a bar graph, or I get to see just a dotted line graph. It helps me kind of look at that on my eyesight and brain a little bit better. But obviously DHA and EPA are going to go up in supplement groups versus those that don't. That's just most of the time that should happen unless someone's not absorbing that omega-3 status. So good increase in those levels. But what was a little bit different here is this looks at neurofilament light. First on the left is the treatment versus the placebo. So there was really not much of an impact at all in this study when it comes to improving those outcomes. Really, there was not much. There was no significant difference between groups, whether it was treatment or placebo. There was no difference when it comes to starters versus non-starters on the effective impact, as well as higher risk or lower risk groups based on their levels and markers of inflammation. So this was, but where there was an improvement, which was interesting to look at, those that had the lowest omega-3 index levels typically had the highest levels of neurofilament light. There were a few cases where that may have not been the case, but overall, those that were in that 2 to 4% range, as you can see, had higher levels of neurofilament light. There were no athletes that reached an omega-3 index of 8%. So that is something that we need to pay attention to, especially moving forward as more research is done, is to see and I tell my colleagues, and as we work with this on testing, test your athletes like now, as the football season, as hockey season, as seasons end, as you're moving into next season. The goal is to get into that season at 8%. It's not to start testing when the season starts, because in my opinion, that's a little bit too late to test. You want to go into that season. So when we look at this study, what the authors mentioned was conclusions was neurofilament light increased significantly without concussion diagnosis. It was high in starters versus non-starters. A lower omega-3 index was associated with a higher neurofilament light. Fish oil was not able to mitigate the increase, but they did say we use an ethyl ester form versus a triglyceride or krill, which means it's less bioavailable. So what that means also is it may reduce crossing of the blood-brain barrier, which may not have nearly as of an impact on reducing inflammation in the brain. So that is something that we have to look forward to moving forward, is maybe having a study comparing two different forms. So they were unable to replicate the results, but from previous studies, possibly due to their subjects starting with a much lower neurofilament light value in this study versus some of the other studies, but also due to scheduling issues with the team. They were not, blood collection 24 hours post-game was not possible. So those are all important things to note with the study. All right, so why maybe higher doses? Especially when it comes to things like this, it's to balance that 6-to-3 ratio, right? None of these athletes were above 8% or 8%. So that means they're going to have a lot more inflammation. Their 6-to-3 ratio is probably going to be in that 10 to 15 to 1 range, unless they're in that 7% omega-3 index range. But the goal when they have a TBI is to feed the brain DHA and saturate the brain to help that improve. Omegas are just a tool. It's not a cure by any means. It's an opportunity to provide nutrients which may support the recovery process. All right, let's dive into a little bit of the research on the athletic performance side, right? Body composition. This is a time of year in the next couple of weeks, everyone's going to be trying to do a new me, and they're going to want to change body composition. And is omega-3 something that can be helpful with that process, right? And obviously diet is going to be the most critical piece, but People are taking things that are more on the stimulant side, but where do these type of nutrients come in? This was a study that looked at overweight adults with a BMI greater than 25 with high blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, pretty big dose of fish oil at 6 grams a day or 6 grams of sunflower oil. They combined it with exercise or compared it by itself. The protocol for exercise was walking 3 days a week, 45 minutes, nothing really intense, and then looked at max heart rate, lipids, blood pressure, body comp via DEXA, and arterial function. And what they saw that those with on fish oil, the higher dose of fish oil and exercise, saw a significant reduction in fat mass and had an increase. So you can see that black bar. That was the reduction in fat mass. That was the fish oil and exercise group, and also saw the best increase in lean mass compared to those that were not on it. But even those that were just on fish oil alone didn't really see any decrease in fat mass. So exercise was a critical component of this outcome. If we look at triglycerides and HDL, obviously triglycerides were equal, exercise had no impact on that. It was really the fish oil that had the improvement in outcome. And then when we look at HDL, fish oil by itself actually was surprisingly had a better outcome than just exercise alone. But looking at fish oil in week 6 versus fish oil in week 12. This looks at brachial artery diameter. So how does omega-3 help with blood flow? And as we can see here, week 0 all the way to week 12, we saw an improvement with the sunflower oil. We saw no improvement in those markers. The next study looked at just supplement fish oil on resting metabolic rate and body comp. Also, the marker of cortisol and stress. Does it have any impact in reducing stress in the body? So another pretty decent dose of omega-3 used, 44 men and women healthy, not really looking at exercise, 4 grams of fish oil, 4 grams of safflower oil, and they excluded individuals who ate fish or those with any type of metabolic or endocrine disorder, and looked at resting metabolic rate as well as body fat via BOD-POD. Similar improvements as the previous study, so a nice increase in fat-free mass in the fish oil group versus the safflower oil group, and then a decrease in fat mass in those groups. So pretty similar outcomes between those two studies. What was interesting is just looking at the course of that, we saw a drop in cortisol, and we saw a slight increase in resting metabolic rate. So nothing drastically significant, but over the course of that time, those subjects saw a little bit less stress. So could there be a benefit there of using this? And I think more studies need to be done, or maybe have been done, but not familiar with the outcome. This was a newer study that Jeffrey Heilson, again, he's researched omega-3 quite extensively in looking at the impact of long chain or omega-3 in college athletes, looking at body comp, strength, and power. So this was a study that was published this year. And 27 college athletes, 8 weeks of maintaining their current training, 3 grams of fish oil, combined a little bit more EPA and DHA versus safflower oil. They did finger stick blood samples to look at omega-3 index and looked at hand grip strength, power via the vertical jump, along with peak power and mean power. So what did they see? Obviously, those that were supplementing saw an increase in omega-3 index. And obviously, the placebo group didn't see much, either no change at all, or they saw a decrease for not using. Just looking at some of the parameters and kind of the anthropometrics of these individuals, we saw a little bit of an increase in lean body mass from 56.6 to 57.3 kilograms. Fat-free mass also went up just slightly, and then fat mass decreased slightly, and body fat dropped slightly as well. But when we look at hand grip strength, we saw a pretty significant improvement when it comes to hand grip strength as well as counter movement jumps in the fish oil group versus the placebo group. So overall, percent change in whole blood fatty acid was positively correlated with hand grip strength, a little bit about 9.5, 9.1% over those 8 weeks. So EPA and EPA in the AA ratio was not associated with any change in peak power or that jump strength. So overall, from an athletic training standpoint and performance standpoint, we know inflammation is a big thing. That's one thing we see from an athletic performance standpoint is, why should athletes use this? It's really from an inflammatory standpoint. Cell signals and athletic performance, we know EPA and DHA support cell health, joint comfort, tissue regeneration, as well as joint mobility and healthy recovery. So they work synergistically. From some of the studies that we're seeing in that, when you ingest EPA and DHA, about 1 or 2 grams, it may be beneficial in counteracting exercise-induced inflammation. So let's really look at what do the studies say around this, because tissue injury or inflammation with a higher omega-3 to 6, we can see possibly a lot more recovery or faster recovery there and potentially complete resolution versus those that are consuming a lot of omega-6. And we know that young athlete population, fast food and processed foods are just high in those type of diets. Those collegiate and professional programs that have access to, better food quality, better food supply are going to have the ability to feed these athletes more nutrient-rich foods, but still when they're, fending for their own, they're still going to eat omega-6 rich foods outside of what's provided on training tables. So this study, Richard Bloomer's done a lot of work on the inflammatory side of things. He looked at the effects of EPA and DHA on resting and exercise-induced inflammatory stress. So basically put a heavy weighted backpack, had people climb on a treadmill, and then gave them 4.4 grams of fish oil, equally dosed between EPA and DHA, and measure those markers of inflammation and oxidative stress. So this is just kind of the study design of 6 weeks of supplementation, testing them, so loading them up with omega-3, washing out, switching the groups, another 6 weeks of supplementation, and then testing them throughout those phases. So when we look at markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein and tumor necrosis factor, you can see in the C-reactive protein group up top, those that were on those 4.4 grams of EPA and DHA saw a significant reduction from rest all the way to 2 days after exercise in CRP. When we look at tumor necrosis factor, the same outcome was pretty similar, a little bit less of a distribution or separation between, but still significant when it comes to those levels of inflammation 48 hours after that bout of activity. This is a study that looked at a little bit more recent in 2022 that various dosages of omega-3 or fish oil on recovery and muscle soreness following exercise. So this was done in collegiate athletes after a rigorous bout of eccentric exercise. So as you know, eccentric exercise is where muscle damage occurs the most. They supplemented for 7.5 weeks, anywhere from 2, 4, or 6 grams a day, and then looked at vertical jump, knee extensor strength, and 40-yard sprint, along with the T-test agility, and then a perceived soreness. So really did a 1 rep max baseline testing, then really put them through an exhaustive bout of eccentric exercise with supplementation, and then did a lot of blood work over the course of those next 3 days to see what happened in regards to looking at things like creatine kinase. So here we looked at vertical jump, and what I thought was impressive, the 6-gram group had the best outcome overall, but there was not a massive drop when it came to vertical jump. So after they did their pre-testing and then went to the initial phase, there was a slight drop. And as you can see in all things, there's going to be a slight drop on that second marker. But then it started to recoup pretty quickly, which is like, wow, that's impressive, where those that received 2 and 4 grams still had a pretty low level of vertical jump rebound. So they tested them all throughout the day. And then, really within 4 hours, they were almost back to baseline. Within 24 hours, they were pretty much equally back to baseline from their vertical jump height with the 6-gram group. It took the other groups a little bit more time to kind of get back to baseline. But again, that's a pretty high dose. So we're not sitting here and saying everybody needs to start getting on 6 grams. It's just a way to look at these higher dosages were ways to mitigate that exercise-induced inflammation. If we looked at perceived soreness, obviously the 6-gram group was the most impressive in the outcome, especially with 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour. There was not much difference when it comes to that. All of these groups, the 4 and the 2 and the 6 were pretty close together, but then they started to separate themselves a lot within 24 hours. 48 hours was obviously the biggest marker, where the 6-gram group was feeling pretty good, and looks like they were pretty equal to baseline testing. And then 72 hours, everyone was back to feeling pretty good. If we look at markers of muscle damage, so if we take blood work and look at creatine kinase, then this is going to happen in everybody. So if we go do an exhaustive bout of lower body squats and deadlifts, creatine kinase is going to be elevated, whether you did upper body or not. But what was kind of cool to see here is a lot of drastic increases. 2 hours post an exhaustive bout, nothing really too drastic from an increase on both sides. 4 hours, pretty similar increases, but 24 hours, look at the 6-gram group. Still had an elevation, but no near the elevation we saw in the 2 and the 4-gram group, even more than the placebo group, which is kind of interesting to see that they didn't really have much of a benefit there. But that 6-gram group was basically back to where they were pre-testing within a 3-day window, where others were still significantly elevated in those blood markers of creatine kinase. And then the last study to kind of look at this was just, looking at young adults after heavy eccentric exercise, kind of the same thing, but they did look at cortisol in this. So they looked at CRP, I think they looked at salivary cortisol. They're also looking at peak power and torque. So this also included the omega-3 index in this study, kind of comparing to see where does the omega-3 index come in versus just looking at EPA and DHA or supplementation. So this was interesting to see that those that had a higher index greater than 4%, the lower group, had less delayed onset muscle soreness. So you can see, obviously, muscle soreness is going to happen. You can't prevent it 24 hours, though. Those with a higher index of greater than 4% had less, and that dropped, and that became really significant different between 3 days or 72 hours, and then still 4 days later, delayed onset muscle soreness was still lower in those with a higher omega-3 index. CRP levels, we've kind of already talked about that, but that's going to be pretty common. If you're consuming omega-3, you have a good omega-3 index, you're going to have lower levels of CRP in these studies that we've looked at. But also what was cool is looking at the recovery time and peak torque. Those that had higher levels of index also had a much higher improvement in force, which is important for an athlete because it's when you look at athletic performance, right? It's going to vary. There's so many markers we can look at and so many different things we can discuss. Performance is a big term, but it's getting that athlete through the season, right? So they're fresh in the off season and they've recovered from a long season. So how can we maintain that level of performance? How do we know there's going to be weight loss. We know there's going to be decrements in performance and strength at some point. All the intense weightlifting is done in the off season, but can we mitigate some of those things that we know to be expected with the right type of nutrients, right? And this is one of those things that we might be able to do that with. And then again, another study looking at muscle soreness. We've kind of talked a little bit about this. This is a pretty big group of official giving 6 grams, 5 grams of EPA. So we haven't seen a study with that big of a dose, 1 gram of DHA, and then 6 grams of corn or soy oil. Looked at only really supplementation for 1 week, did a bunch of tests on elbow flexion, leg extension, and then looked at muscle soreness. But really the outcome, I'm not going to walk you through all the stuff that we've already done. Soreness was 33 to 42% lower in the fish oil group versus the placebo group. So that was pretty impressive. And then the last piece is looking at skeletal muscle growth and hypertrophy and regeneration. Really the outcome of this study was omega-3s can modulate molecular signaling for muscle growth. So we typically post-workout feed athletes protein and carbohydrate, right? Protein and carbohydrate combined, especially protein, is going to increase muscle protein synthesis. You combine it with carbohydrate, it's much better than protein alone. And those activate things that are going to help the muscle repair itself. But based on some of the work we've seen also, omega-3 has similar properties where it activates muscle stem cells. It can drive skeletal muscle repair to damaged tissues from exercise, and it does stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So post-workout, maybe it's good to put a little bit of liquid fish oil in that smoothie. It's not going to taste very good, but it probably will be a lot more beneficial from an inflammatory response as well as a muscle protein synthesis response. There's other ways to do that besides using a liquid form. But it also may combat sarcopenia, is what this study was saying, and that needs to be further explored, right? We just can't go saying that, but we have some studies that were done. I know Sarah Okawa has done studies looking at healthy aging and protein doses and creatine supplementation, but does omega-3 fit into that? And that's something we have to look at. So should you, as we kind of get to the dosing part, should you take a supplement, right? Should athletes be using omega-3? And number one, are you eating omega-3 rich fish at least 3 to 4 days a week? Number one, so have you tested your levels? Not with 95% of the globe or 90% of the globe deficient. I think the first thing we have to do is, we know a lot of people are going to be deficient, but where are you? And then where do we need to go from there based on what your current levels are? Supplementation is just an easy, convenient way to increase omega-3. Food first is always the best approach, but I know myself, I'm not going to eat a lot of fish that are rich in omega-3. I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to eat them on a regular basis. So I choose supplementation. Some people might choose, hey, I'm just going to eat fish or do an algae if you're vegan or vegetarian, and that's completely fine. The goal is to balance that 6-3 ratio. So we just got to figure out what works best for you. And if you're working in athletic performance, what is best? The question next comes, what's the best way to get this done? So if you're not familiar with forms of fish oil, there's several different types. A few newer types are coming on the market, but really the 3 primary ethyl ester, that's what most of your omega-3 fish oil is today, is going to be an ethyl ester form. Another is going to be krill or phospholipid. It's a phospholipid form, also known as krill. And then there's triglyceride base, which is another form that's used with a lot of different products are out there that have that. But this study kind of looked at what's the bioavailability of those and which one of those increases EPA and DHA in the blood the best, right? Because that's what's important. They all will do that, but where can I get there a little bit quicker? If you're working with athletes, then you have a timeline, especially compliance is an issue with athletes too. So this was a study that looked at 72 subjects, 36 men and women between 21 and 56, excluded them if they took fish oil. And then the study design was randomized to 6 groups: triglyceride base, ethyl ester, fish body oil, cod liver oil, free fatty acids, and corn oil. And then 4 double-blinded, given concentrated fish oils. They took 5 capsules twice a day. And then 2 single-blinded groups given cod liver oil and fish body oil. And the total EPA and DHA intake range from anywhere from 3.1 to 3.6. So you can see how they dose them out over the course of that study. Some need to take a little bit more, but as you can see here, a pretty big dose of capsules. 5 in the morning, 5 in the evening. The cod liver group had to take 22 capsules. So that's not going to probably warrant much compliance when you look at people in general. They don't want to take a lot of capsules. So how do we get them the best bang for their buck and less, right? So even any of these groups, you're not going to get many people taking 10 capsules a day, especially from one type of thing. So what we saw in this paper was, the triglyceride-based omega-3 had the best impact on EPA levels, as well as the cod liver oil had a better outcome on DHA levels. But when you look at combined EPA and DHA milligram per liter, it was better for the triglyceride group. It had a better outcome than especially the ethyl ester group. Not sure what the fish body oil product was. I thought that was interesting. I'm envisioning somebody taking fish oil and rubbing it, on their arms and legs. And I advise you, from spilling fish oil on the ground and wiping it up with a shirt and trying to wash clothes, don't ever do that. It's not a really smart idea because it's going to smell for a couple of days. But yeah, the triglyceride basis has been superior in studies. This was another study that looked at a similar outcome, looking at different types of products from a triglyceride-based omega-3. They did 35 different subjects, 28 days of omega-3, followed by a 4-week washout. Same type of outcome, just a little bit of a different group of products from a concentrated triglyceride, an ethyl ester, a krill oil, and a triglyceride salmon oil. And they basically just followed the manufacturing dosage guidelines. They didn't try to equally get them the same amount of EPA and DHA. They just said, look, take this many capsules of each product. And what we saw was that the triglyceride-based group had a better outcome. They had the best improvements. Ethyl ester actually came in, I think, looks like second, or no, I'm sorry, it came in third when it came to this. But the group that had the least improvement was the phospholipid, or the plasma phospholipid. So when we look at EPA and DHA status in this group athlete, what was interesting here, so if I go back real quick, overall, EPA and DHA, we saw an improvement from the triglyceride group from day 1 to day 28. This looks like within each fatty acid, so this was the mean percentage change in EPA and DHA overall. So we saw EPA and DHA. If we look at EPA alone, ethyl ester had a pretty nice, nice outcome there. When we look at EPA and DHA status combined, triglyceride base was the one that had the best improvement overall over the course of those 28 days. So again, just general protocol for usage, it's going to range. Minimum of what we see, and I'm going to show you, we have a great calculator we've created as a team with research that was done with Harris and his group. But usually from a general health and perspective, somewhere between 2 and 3 grams is going to be a recommended dosage, even for athletes. Some of these are just things I've used with athletes in the past. When I worked with athletes to try to, it really depends on where their levels are to kind of help. But usually that 2 to 4 gram dose, 4 being a little bit higher than usual. But with where athletes are testing at that 3 to 4% range, this is going to help them get to a little bit of a better level of 8% at the right time. But also, this is just based on the studies we saw today. Was some of those studies at 4 grams showed a little bit of a higher outcome. I know some questions and concerns we've gotten. What about bleeding, or what about, are you concerned about that? I'm really not, and especially the research doesn't show any concern with that. I'll come back to that in a second. My concern would be more of the saturated fat and omega-6 fat intake. So there's a lot of concern about it. What if you take 4,000 milligrams of omega-3? Is that risky? Well, I think what's riskier is the amount of omega-6 being consumed, or the amount of saturated fat being consumed. There's very little concern about that, but when we take a little bit of omega-3, I think we get concerned, and I think it should be the opposite. I think we should be, recommending more omega-3 and not pushing as much on the high saturated fat, maybe high omega-6 fat side. Now, this is not anything we recommend or support from an organizational standpoint. Dr. Michael Lewis has done a lot of work around this area as well. He's got a book on this, but he's studied omega-3 and some things that I've been fortunate to present at a conference in him and just kind of heard his protocol and what he's recommending. By no means don't go out and do this. After I'd speak with physicians, speak with Dr. Lewis first, but his protocol was really depending on severity of TBI using higher dosages, right? He's worked with Dr. Bales. They published some work together to kind of look at that and then really getting individuals back to a protocol, back to a level to where his recommendation was to feed more DHA to the brain and omega-3 to the brain to kind of help it reduce neuroinflammation. So this is his protocol. But I just wanted to share that. A lot of sports dietitians are aware of his work and has seen his book and seen the work he's done on that. But this is not something standard that's recommended across the industry. We have an incredible calculator. Our team did some research with Walker in 2019 and this is public on our website. You can go to OmegaQuant.com under resources and really search omega-3 calculator and just kind of look at the different dosages. What I wanted to show you here is just, getting someone to 8%. How can you do that? If someone is 4% using different forms of omega-3. So you can see here, ethyl ester, you just have to take about 2,200 milligrams per day combined EPA and DHA if you want to go from 4% to 8%. How long does that take is a question we get. And it's really, you can't give like a flat, everyone's going to get there in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. It depends on the individual, probably a little bit of the size of that individual. Does their body absorb omega-3? Are they compliant with taking it? If you move to a triglyceride or krill base, you can see the dosage drops about 800 milligrams roughly. So that's why we recommend, use a form that's a little bit more bioavailable. Obviously with athletes, it's going to be a little bit different and that you just can't use any form. You have to make sure athletes use third-party tested product. That is critical. And I hear this a lot. Oh, well, the company says the product does internal testing. That means nothing. If you cannot prove your product was third-party tested by, Informed Sport or NSF, the product's not certified. It's not tested. If a company decided, as having worked in this industry and launched a brand for a large hospital system, internal testing means nothing. So, to protect your athletes, the college sports and professional sports RDs know this. If you're working with professional athletes, if you're a practitioner, it doesn't matter what product you're using, it has to have the certification. If not, you're putting your athletes at risk. And I've seen practitioners do that. I've had athletes come to me and say, look, I tested positive for a banned steroid. I was recommended this by so-and-so practitioner. And I was like, wow, that product should never have been used and you should know better. And one of my clients was when she came to me, she was coming to me on a 2-year ban in track and field because of something her practitioner recommended as an amino acid. And I was like, so those are all avoidable things. Companies that claim they're tested but not, then that's something you want to stay away from. So what this does is it reduces the athlete's risk for testing positive. Obviously, as I mentioned, internal testing is not considered third-party testing unless they can provide you with a certificate from the company with that lot, then I would not trust that. So finally, just some things in summary. It's a versatile nutrient, right? It's a very versatile nutraceutical. We do need to increase this. I personally think if you're not taking omega-3 just for your general health, you're probably doing yourself a disservice. It's important to use a good quality omega-3 for optimizing your health, but also for athletes. We need more studies, right? We have 3 studies right now that have looked at the effect of concussion and TBI in a full season of sport. So we need more. And it should be considered, really, in my opinion, the first nutritional strategy for athletes. When you take them off the field, athletic trainers, sports dietitians should be using this as part of the therapy process. 2 to 3 grams, I think, is a really good, healthy place to start. But again, getting their levels tested, it'll take about 2 to 3 months, maybe a little bit higher, longer, depending on the individual. A triglyceride fish oil is best. And again, an omega-3 index associated at 8% or higher, improvement in concussion recovery with less damage, and also normal inflammation modulation. So if you have questions about testing, if you would like to test, please reach out. You can email me at this email address. It's tavis@omegaquant.com. I'll be happy to schedule some time and walk you through all of our testing programs that we offer, but also now open to any questions.
Thank you, Tavis. That was really interesting. I have some questions here. The first one was, if someone has an omega-3 index of 11.64 on the omega-3 index, what level of omega-3 should they continue to take for maintenance?
So did someone read my report? Because that's actually my exact score. So I'm wondering if
Nice.
my wife joined in and is asking. Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think some of these questions I might have to go to you as the scientist. But
Yeah.
here's the way I look at that is I know some of the research says once you get to a normal level, right? Do you stop taking? And I think the answer is no, only because the minute we stop taking omega-3s, the minute 6 goes up, saturated goes up, and you're getting back to that level of because this is not like vitamin D, right? This is not a fat soluble vitamin that is being stored and can cause calcification of the arteries and other issues. At least I don't, and Christina, you might be able to answer this better, but do we have any studies on these really high? I don't think we have much research on high dosage like 13, 14%, because there's not a lot of people in those categories and we don't really know long term, but at least everything I've read would seem to think that um, we should continue taking somewhere between 1,500, 2,000 milligrams a day, at least to maintain those levels. But any insight that you would have?
Yeah, no, I just this is what I've learned. There is no maintenance dose. What you're taking, you take it for 3 or 4 months, that is what your blood level gets to. And if you go down, your blood level will go down over 3 or 4 months. If you go up in dosage, it'll go up. Typically, there are other things that can affect it, but on average, that's the case. So if you're taking 3,000 milligrams a day to be at 11%, you will have to take 3,000 milligrams a day to stay at 11%. The question is, do you need to stay at 11%? Do you need to be that high? Is 8% better for them? Or some people feel better at a higher dose and at a higher percent. It's a very individualized thing, but you can't take 3,000 to get to 11 and then go back to 2,000 and expect it to stay at 11. It'll go down. So yes. And there was another question about having too much omega-3s in your system, which you kind of alluded to. And we don't have enough people to have enough data at those high doses to have a strong cutoff. We do see there is evidence of increased improvement in cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular health the higher you go, even past 12%. But we kind of think the best bang for your buck is to get people out of that deficiency zone, out of 4% up to 8, and then going from 8 to 12 or 12 to 15, you might have diminishing returns. And as far as the risks of being too high, the bleeding issue, we have not seen evidence clinically in a pregnancy situation, in surgery, where there's a high risk of bleeding out or having an excessive bleeding event. High omega-3s have not been shown to be an issue for that. They can elongate the clotting time, so that is part of the mechanism of omega-3s, is it reduces the quickness of your blood clotting, which is a good thing. So you might have extra bruising, you might have a little longer time for a cut to stop bleeding or heal. And so those are the things that when people get really high levels of omega-3s, they start to see extra bruising and things like that. And really high levels could affect the intensity of an inflammatory response, potentially to a virus or sickness, because it's dampening the pro-inflammatory side a little bit too much sometimes. Okay, so that was 2 questions rolled into one. For brain health, supplements higher in DHA seem to be more beneficial. For body composition, are omega-3 supplements higher in EPA recommended? So I think you're saying DHA for brain and EPA for body.
Yeah, no, and I don't know if that's truly known, because there's only been a few studies looked at on body composition. So I don't know if we can say this form's best for body comp, this one. I think that's the way the study was designed. I personally think equal parts would be ideal just for someone when it comes to that, because truly to change body composition, to lower body fat, a calorie deficit's critical, right? You can't lose fat mass without being in some sort of moderate to a progressive deficit over the course of time. You don't want to be in a drastic deficit, because we have to have adequate protein to maintain lean muscle mass at the same time with lifting weights. So I think it just provides a small incremental improvement I wouldn't rely on omega-3 as, hey, I want to lose fat mass. Let's take omega-3. Obviously, lifting weights 3 to 5 days a week, adequate protein, a progressive calorie deficit is going to be the most important. Adding,
Mhm.
2 grams of omega-3 could be helpful, as we've seen from some of those papers.
Yeah. Yeah. And when it comes to weight loss, that its calories are more important than the omega-6, omega-3 situation. Let's do, I have several patients who are allergic to seafood and fish. What alternative products could be best recommended to help these individuals achieve 8%?
Yeah, that's where algae is going to be really, your algae oil is going to be your best option when it comes to that. So if they have any type of fish allergy, and you just want to make sure, because my daughter was for the longest time had a shellfish allergy, but I still gave her liquid fish oil because it was anchovies, it was mackerel, it was sardines. She was not allergic. So as long as they're not allergic to that type of fish, they should be okay. But again, get them tested. Algae oil is an alternative for them for those that are not, for those that are allergic to those sources.
Yeah. And I would say on top of that, the oils are fat only. They don't have any protein in it. They shouldn't, and especially if it's a more processed oil. And so even some fish oils could be free of what's causing the allergy. But of course, all of this has to be done under the care of the doctor if you're testing out different supplements, and ensuring that that it's not causing a reaction. But yeah, the algae are the best completely non-fish option. The other thing I would say about getting people to 8% who are vegetarian or vegan, it takes the same kind of dosage as fish oil, and algal supplements are more expensive at this point, and it's harder to get a higher dose of those versus a regular fish oil. So I'm not married to 8%, as unless I'm at 8%, then I'm not healthy. Getting people up to 6% is actually shown to have great benefits. Just getting them out of the 4% range is really important. So if someone doesn't want to take like 8 pills a day, you don't like you can incrementally just starting to get something for them is key. Something is better than nothing. How do we determine if supplements are high quality?
Yeah, that's the thing consumers just don't know, right? We don't know the quality of the product. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned, when it comes to omega-3, a brand that uses it in triglyceride form is going to call that out right on the front. That's the one thing they're proud about. They want you to know that because they know it's a superior form. It'll say superior triglyceride form on the front or somewhere on the back of that product. If it doesn't say that or specify the type of omega-3, more than likely it's going to be ethyl ester every single time. And then, of course, the finished product, if you're working with athletes, it will have that logo on the bottle, or the company can provide you with a proof of certification. So if it doesn't have the Informed Sport or NSF logo on the bottle, or they can't provide you with certification to make sure that the product has been tested, then I'd look for another alternative.
And always check the dosing. Serving size, EPA and DHA, calculate it based on EPA and DHA every time. Let's see. Can you use OmegaQuant tests on kids and base the recommendations off these test results?
I mean, I can speak not from the research side, but I know I tested my 11-year-old, and yes, I mean, I guess yes, you can. But Christina, I think that's probably a better question on your side. Can we on that? Is it suitable for children?
Yeah, so it is. But there are some caveats. So with kids, their levels tend to be lower. So usually we aim for a 6% with kids. You can still aim for 8%. It's kind of that tolerability of the supplementation issue. So with kids, we just expect lower levels to begin with. Expecting a 2 or 3% is actually pretty normal in a kid, where we usually don't see that in an adult. And the other issue could be the lancets we use can be sometimes too aggressive for a child's fingers. So if you are working with a lot of children, you might want to get your own like smaller lancets, just to avoid excessive bruising. But that's hit or miss. It really just depends on the size of the little finger. But our reports are geared toward adults. They're based on adult research. And so you can use that number. It's still the same number. The blood looks the same, kid or adult. But you just might want to use a little bit more nuance in how you're counseling with it.
Looks like this next question is more clinical based.
Yeah, I think the really clinical questions, I think that's out of the scope of this. So we can, Helen, if you want to maybe email us after, and we can kind of maybe give you some papers, but these are probably more outside of our scope as RDs. Let's see. Too much omega-3s we've answered. Specific supplements for people in Ireland. I think you just have to go looking at what's available to you, look at the dose, look at what the form is, find that out. You can go online for that. And those really the two key things, making sure you're taking the supplement with a meal that has fat in it, helps absorption as well. But I don't have recommendations for fish oils available in Ireland. Michael, any feedback? Green info. 6-ounce farm salmon. Yep. So someone wanted to mention that 6 ounces of most farm salmon have about 1.8 grams of EPA and DHA. So and we usually like the old serving sizes were really in the 3-gram form, but probably most people are eating a 3 ounce. Most people are probably eating closer to 6 ounces. Having that hits a lot of your targets. And fish also, it is really bioavailable. It's a great seafood have a lot of other great things, other nutrients that are really important. Do you find the weight of an individual affects the omega-3 dosing? Higher weight individuals needing a higher dose?
I guess it depends on their. I mean, I've seen athletes at offensive linemen in the 280 to 300-pound range had the same improvement in outcome using the same dose as athletes that were 100 pounds lighter. Now, again, that's anecdotal. That's not controlled in an environment. I don't know if we have studies that really, and Christina, you might be able to answer that a little bit better when it comes to looking at each weight of an individual on the athletic performance side. I think it just depends on absorption rates of that individual and how their body, well, like you said, when they take it, are they taking it with food, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's right, Tavis. When we did the study with Walker to look at what would affect the response of the omega-3 index to a defined dose of EPA and DHA, we had weights, we had BMIs. They did not make it into our equations. They weren't powerful enough. But I don't think we had a big range in BMIs in the data. So also anecdotally, I feel as though usually people who have are higher weight do require a higher dose to get to the 8% range. And in I think especially you're going to be on the higher end of most of the recommended ranges. Like the lowest recommended dose for here today was about 2 grams, and that's a pretty high dose in a general population. But for athletes, it seems like that's really where you need to start. And don't be surprised if you're at 3 and 4 grams for some of your bigger athletes. Do we have any education or quick reference guides around omega-3 supplementation and concussions? We don't, not yet.
No, nothing really specific to that just yet. Something we'll have to talk about in putting together. But yeah, April, I have your information, so I'm going to reach out and we can talk about putting together some information just in general for sports teams. I know a lot of the collegiate professional teams do a lot of that internally, but we can look at it on the high school side and see if there's something. So if you want to reach out to me, I'm just going to type my email address in the chat. That way, if you want to reach out to me, we can work on something for you in the future.
Yeah. What would be a reason that some people do not absorb effectively fish oils? My client's one of them, and we've done multiple omega-3 index tests. Tavis, I might take this because I've dealt with this a lot.
I'm like, yes, please.
You need to ask them about their diet, about their fish intake, and know exactly what supplement they're taking. And then also find out when and how they're taking it. So if they're taking a supplement on an empty stomach, that's a big red flag. That can really, really reduce absorption, primarily if it's an ethyl ester form. If it's a triglyceride form, it's usually less affected by whether or not you're taking the supplement with fat. The ethyl esters absolutely do. I had a patient that I consulted on who was taking about between 1,400 and then bumped it up to over 2 grams a day of an ethyl ester form. She took it in the morning before breakfast and didn't absorb it at all. She stayed at 5% for like a year. And then she changed to a triglyceride form, and her levels bumped up to about 7% within a couple months, and it was only 1,200 milligrams a day. So when all those factors, when they're taking it, are they taking it with a fatty meal, and what the form is, those are really key to make sure those are understood. If all of those check out, some of it's just try a different type of supplement. I have talked to someone who said they were taking 7 grams a day and their levels were like 6%. But looking at the supplement, it wasn't from a reputable brand. It didn't have any testing on it. It said the dose, and everything looked right on the internet, but it was very cheap. Just try something that's a little more reputable. And beyond that, it could be some other fat absorption issues. It could be a bigger gut health issue. So potentially working on that first and then coming back in with the supplements if need be. Just trying a lot of different things and making sure, trying to give people the best chance to be compliant. So if they don't like taking something that's like 3 big pills a day, try and find something else. Find a liquid, find a smaller pill, take it at different times of the day, like really, really hone in on the habits, because people might think they're taking it regularly when maybe they're taking it every other day. And it's just because it's an unpleasant experience. So trying to hone in on that. Those are my recommendations, but we've definitely seen that before, and there's usually a reason. So I think that's most of the more general questions that we're able to answer here today. Thank you so much, Tavis. It was great to just hear your experience and hear all this wide range of effects for omega-3 and our athletes. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you all.